So, Sir John Manzoni, thanks very much. Welcome to this session. Really appreciate your time in doing this. You're one of the pioneers of porosity in terms of those cross-sector skills around commercial skills into government and vice versa. So absolutely delighted to ask you a few questions about this subject. So can I begin by saying, what motivated you to make the move at the time that you did?
I can't actually put my finger on exactly why I did it, except there's one or two features. The first feature was that somebody I respected suggested that it was a good idea. That's the first point, and that I think, so, you know, people tend to follow people, right? They don't. Yep. Second, a friend of mine actually over dinner one night said, well, John, you've done that twice. I mean, you know, I had some option in the oil industry again. Said, you've done that twice, why don't you go do something different? And it was almost as simple as that. I didn't go in to the government to do the job I ended up doing. I went in as to lead the Major Projects Authority, and then 6 months later became the chief executive. But nonetheless, I actually said to myself, you know what, why not? What I found, which I think reinforced, you know, the motivation, which is what I then say to everybody who talks to me about it. It is both. It is an order of magnitude more complex than running a company.
Yeah.
It is significantly more difficult than running a company, but it is probably an order of magnitude more important than running a company.
Mm.
And those, I think, you know, if you're interested in complex organizational form, and this is one of the issues, right? Because the top of that entity, and I'm not talking about the politics here, I'm talking about the civil service. This is a big, complicated machine. This is proper systems leadership, which you rarely get close to, even in the biggest of companies.
Yeah.
It is properly more complex, more complex because the objective functions are less clear. But it is equally much more important. And when you've worked in it both, in both sides of that, you can see what I mean by more important. You know, the government does quite difficult things, actually. Business drives in a pretty straight line usually.
So in terms of your industry experience, what did you think translated well?
For business people, let me say, you know, we often say strategy is 10% strategy and 90% execution, right?
Yeah, yeah.
And the government is full of strategists. That's what they call policy. And that was my observation when I went in as the Major Projects Authority. I had this conversation with David Cameron and Francis Moore and said, look, you know, you've got a serious problem here.
Yeah.
Because you have no experience, you know, that you have all intellect and no experience. I have said lots and lots of times, you can't do policy without intellect because it's complicated, but neither can you do delivery without experience, because experience, you know, your experience comes from the gut, intellect comes from the head, and you need one of the interesting things about government is, of course, it's full of, by the way, they're wonderful people and they are super bright.
Yeah. Much
brighter in general, the private sector, you know, as a sort of generalization. But so you need to have intellect, but you also need experience. Yeah. So what actually really, I mean, the reason that I found a place up until I arrived, pretty much every person that had gone in from business into general government had bounced out. And that's because there was nowhere for them to contribute, because it was all about the policy. And I worked right next to Jeremy Hayward as the Cabinet Secretary, who was smart enough to know what he didn't know.
Yeah.
And if you like, I was the implementation guy. So what I brought, and what government really needs and wants and recognizes it generally, is experience. And so because otherwise, if you're in a conversation with the minister, it's simply an intellectual debate, and in the end, the minister always decides, because that's the elected party. And oftentimes intellectuals will both overcomplicate things and assume they can be done a lot faster than in fact they can. And the only way you can be heard at the top in the political circles is when you say, I get it, Minister, but it's going to take you twice as long as you think. And they say, why? because that's not a convenient answer for them. And you say, well, trust me, I've done it for 25 years, so I'm just telling you. And they have to respect that. So experience is what is so important. The real question is, how do you bring that experience in? Now, what I did, partly because if I didn't do what I did, I wouldn't have had anybody to talk to. What I did is restructure the civil service into the matrix structure that is existing today. By the way, there were no cross-cutting things. This is a barony. This is a stovepiped system, and I concluded that the only way to build that experience in government was to create career paths for young people which weren't policy, which were commercial career path, or a projects path, or a technical path, or a finance path, or a whatever. And so I concluded that I needed to create a series of functional leads, heads, which happened to report to me in the Cabinet Office. And then we built functional structures so that a young person could go into government and have a career. I mean, we'll talk about remuneration, but could have a career building experience in their chosen career path in government. Now, that was the lasting bit that I did. Of course, that's really hard in an organisation that doesn't understand how to do it. It took 5 years to bed in, but nonetheless, I think was successful. And so what didn't work and what won't work is that if you go in and you say, well, you're obviously all stupid because you're not doing it the way I know how to do it in the corporate world. Because I think there's a sort of an appreciation that one has to acknowledge that says, government does do some quite difficult things. The blending of social policy objectives with, so I always say, for instance, the role of an economic regulator is actually really hard. How do you create an environment which meets a government objective, but nonetheless it enrolls business and private capital and private incentive structures and all of those things in a way that works? And we can see failures all along, where we get that wrong, because it's actually properly difficult to do that. So one has to acknowledge that, I mean, there are some very different things happen in government that don't happen in business. Delegation goes upwards because delegation has to go upwards for policy. It doesn't go downwards, which is what happens everywhere in the corporate world. And one of the complexities is, how do you have both things happening? On the one hand, to determine the policy, and on the other hand, to actually implement the policy. And that's one of the big disconnects. So there are some very big differences, and one's got to, I think, spend time understanding them, as opposed to, frankly, just trying to churn the civil service into a private corporation, because that won't work. And actually, by the way, the people in there are far too clever.
Yeah.
So I think, one's got to contain one's frustration. I mean, it's fascinating and frustrating in equal measure. One's got to contain the frustration, and one's got to find, a way of, how do you bring that experience to bear in a system which, first of all, it's getting more used to it, but it wasn't used to it.
I think there's sometimes a bit of myth busting about some of the frustrating bits and some of the best bits. But what would you say to that? What were some of the best bits? And likewise,
well, look, the best thing is, like in everything, right? I mean, nothing happens immediately, and nothing that's worthwhile happens immediately. So the best bit for me was that I was able to change the structure of the civil service after many, many years, and to be, in some senses, I think, successful in selling a model which was deeply unfamiliar to that system, and so that was good. I suppose the highlight, an early highlight or an easy highlight of that particular aspect, was that I actually think the transformation of the way government contracts direct services.
Yeah.
So when I arrived, we'd had a decade of what I would call now a race to the bottom for direct outsourcing. So, companies I'd never heard of, Carillion, Interserve, Serco, Capita. Right? I mean, they'd all grown up in the previous decade, and they'd all grown up by bidding low because cost was the only thing that mattered. And that was because there was insufficient experience in government to know what value is versus cost.
Yeah.
So now one or two of them hit the sand,
Yeah.
Carillion being the obvious.
Yeah.
But the rest of them we actually turned around. So in ways that it's not public, but you know, all of them changed management. Many of them went from public to private and back again, and they all changed strategies. And actually, so the way government now contracts direct services from its big suppliers is completely different to the way that it did when I got there. So that's the easiest example. There are others. The frustrations, I suppose, relate to all the bits that I still worry about. I have been unable, and I'm not satisfied with the way we, as I've just mentioned, were able to connect what is a stronger civil service to the politics, and I think that remains to be an issue. That is still an issue, because at a profound level, if you have a system in which delegation goes upwards, it starts to corrupt the leadership model over time.
Yeah. The
leadership model becomes, basically breeds sycophantic behaviour. You know, the leadership model is how, if you know how clever you are, if you deem your role as the quality of your advice to ministers, you can see how that can begin to erode and corrupt a leadership model toward one which is upward looking, which is all about how clever you are and all about how many of the ministers' questions you can answer, as opposed to what I call big leadership, which takes accountability for getting stuff done. And that is an issue. And I have to say that some of the politicians, of course, who don't have the experience to know what it actually means to build systemic capacity and capability, do breed that behaviour, do encourage that behaviour. And that is the one thing that makes me crosser than almost anything, because I actually believe our civil service sounds terribly high-minded and stuff, and it's not meant to be, but the reason that I was so passionate is because I believe this country deserves a better civil service than it had. Not because of the quality of the people in there, but it needed that blend of intellect and experience, and it was lacking the latter. And the problem is when you've got the politicians who just don't understand that, who just don't get it. Many of them do,
yeah, but
some of them don't.
Yeah.
And that is deeply corrosive, in my view, to the building of, you know, systemic capability in our public sector.
Yeah.
And that is a problem.
So executives from commercial, industry, private sectors, what advice would you give as they consider a move into government?
Most important advice, don't do it for the money.
Yeah.
The public sector is, it's a fiendishly complex problem. It cannot pay in the way that the private sector pays. And so you have to be ready to do this, not for money, because if you will find that the balance of complexity and frustrations and all of the rest of it, and the money that you're paid, and sometimes people will sort of say, okay, I'm being paid a lot of money to have all of these problems. If you go in with that will absolutely trip you up straight away. So don't do it for the money is the first piece of advice. The second piece of advice, I think the most interesting, this is a wonderfully rewarding period of one's life, if that's what you want to do. Wonderfully.
Yeah.
As I've said, it is fascinating, it is complex, it is frustrating. And the challenge, which is why it's so interesting, is how do you bring to bear those years of experience and judgment into the public sector, which in the public sector is full of intellect and process, and the process substitutes for experience and judgment. And because there isn't any experience, and therefore there can't be any judgment, so therefore there is process and analysis. And the question, therefore, is how do you bring those two things together for the benefit of the objective? And the objective is itself complex because it is usually a mix of sort of social justice somehow, or you know, and that this is why this is so fascinating. So you have to be ready to stand, you know, how unlock the experience in a way that can be heard. My final piece of advice is don't be shrill and just say, well, you're obviously stupid, do it this way, because that's not the case. You know, you'll know more in a week and you'll know more in a year than you do in a week. So, you know, listen and learn and figure out how to deploy that experience. I think that's the issue.
John, thanks so much. That's sage advice and a really telling point to which to conclude. Sir John Manzoni, thanks very much.